Hi, this week we were asked to discuss disability rights legislation that led up to the signing of the 1990 Americans with Disability Act. I'm going to start with 1917, the Smith-Hughes Act. This act was important because it established assistance to dislocated workers as well as some individuals with disabilities. I think this is really where it all started. In 1918, the Soldier Rehabilitation Act was passed as a result of the World War, and this provided services to veterans of the war. In 1920, we have the Smith-Fess Act, which established VR services for civilians. 1935, the Social Security Act was passed by President Roosevelt, and this established vocational rehabilitation services permanently in the United States. The 1943 Bardeen-La Follette was a very important act in my mind. It established services for individuals with mental health concerns, intellectual disabilities, and it also created VR services for the blind. This, I think, is really important because up until this point, these individuals really hadn't been appropriately serviced. The Rehabilitation Act in 1973 was definitely a huge step forward for the signing of the 1990 ADA. It created client assistance programs, independent living services. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. It was later referred to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and this provides the least restrictive environment for education of children with disabilities. The 1980s brought about some changes for disability rights. In 1986, the Rehab Act amendments provided supported employment for persons with mental illness, intellectual disabilities, and head injuries. In 1988, we have the Fair Housing Act, which was very important for persons with disabilities. It provided for a non-discrimination mandate to the private sector as far as housing goes. It extended accessibility to multiple family dwellings for individuals with disabilities. All of these acts were very important in their own right, and they did lead up to the signing of the most significant piece of legislation that we have in America today, which is the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. The legislation that had the most impact on me personally, I originally talked about the Smith-Fess Act, which gave civilians federal VR services. However, after reviewing all the conversations this week, I find myself going back to the Soldier Rehabilitation Act and even the Smith-Hughes Act, which actually first acknowledged that disabled persons could potentially be rehabilitated. So actually, I'd have to say all three of those acts have had the most impact on me. I think they were both all very important in their own right. And without them, we would have never had the signing of the 1990 ADA. My conversations with Sylvia and Tiffany this week made an impression on me, I would have to say. When I was talking with Tiffany, she did in her post talk about how the schools for the deaf dated back to the 1800s and how that could technically be seen as the beginnings of disability rights legislation. And I do have to agree with her on that. In fact, they also were building schools for the blind back in the 1800s. So this was the beginnings, I would say, for the things that happened in the early 1900s. And then my conversation with Sylvia was very interesting as well. We talked about the atrocities that Hitler caused with persons with disabilities around the time of World War II. it was just an interesting conversation. I thought I'd mention that. That's all I have for this discussion post, and I will see you all the next time.